Karen moved with practiced precision, her mop gliding smoothly across the marble floors of the 27th floor. The building gleamed, immaculate under her care. It was 5:15 a.m. before most employees arrived, but Karen had already been working for nearly 2 hours. Her uniform, pressed neatly, bore her name stitched in white thread across the chest, K. Daniels. She wore it like armor, a quiet symbol of her discipline and pride in work often dismissed as invisible. To the majority of the staff, Karen was a fixture of the building, as dependable as the elevators or the security cameras. She greeted everyone with a smile, remembered birthdays, and helped the new interns find their footing. Most of the employees, especially those in middle management and entry-level roles, respected her deeply. To them, Karen wasn't just the janitor. She was the quiet heartbeat of the place. But among the upper echelons, the owners, the board members, the billionaire family that controlled the company, she was invisible. If they noticed her at all, it was only as a function of their comfort: a warm coffee brought to the wrong room, a freshly polished desk that gleamed under their imported lights. Karen had long stopped expecting fairness from the world. Raised in a working-class neighborhood plagued by underfunded schools and limited opportunities, she had learned early on that nothing would be handed to her. Her mother had cleaned houses, her father had been a mechanic until a back injury ended his career. From them, Karen inherited her unyielding work ethic, and a deep-seated need to break the cycle of hardship. Her kids, Janelle and Marcus, were her reason. Every 4 a.m. alarm, every mopped floor, every ignored comment from executives was for them to put them through college, to make sure they'd never have to wear someone else's name stitched onto their shirts. Still, even the strongest resolve had its cracks. Karen had always maintained a quiet dignity, the kind born from years of navigating both overt and subtle prejudice. Some of the executives made no effort to hide their contempt. "You people are good with cleaning," one had muttered once when Karen had passed by. She hadn't flinched. She just kept walking. She knew the rules: don't make waves. Stay quiet. Do your job well, and you'll keep your position. On that particular Thursday, the air felt unusually tense. There was a high-stakes investor meeting happening on the top floor, involving the Roth family, the billionaire owners of the company. Karen was assigned to clean the boardroom early, before the executives arrived. It wasn't her usual floor, but one of her co-workers had called in sick. She took the change in stride, as always. The boardroom was ostentatious: glass walls, Italian furniture, a crystal carafe of water on the table, untouched. Karen moved silently, cleaning around the perimeter, careful not to disturb the layout of documents already spread across the table. She was nearly done when the elevator door slid open. She was supposed to be alone for another 10 minutes, but in walked the Roth family themselves: Gregory Roth, the patriarch, his wife Evelyn, and their adult children, Bennett and Chloe. They didn't acknowledge her, and Karen instinctively minimized her presence, moving to a corner with her cart and pretending to check supplies. That's when it began. The family had clearly assumed the room was empty aside from themselves. Their voices, unconcerned with discretion, filled the space. "Did you see the janitor this morning?" Chloe said, with a laugh in her voice. She looked like she stepped out of a time machine from the 80s. Evelyn chuckled. "At least she's not like that other one. What's her name? The one who couldn't spell sanitation if her life depended on it." Karen kept her back turned. Her fingers clenched around the handle of the cart. Bennett chimed in, "We pay these people too much, honestly. You'd think cleaning a toilet was brain surgery. I swear, it's charity work employing them." Gregory, not to be outdone, added with a smirk, let them think they're part of something important. Keeps the machine running. The moment you give them real power, they mess it all up. Karen didn't move. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, and the hum of the air conditioner grew louder in the silence that followed. She had endured plenty in her life. Slurs as a teenager, being passed over for promotions, teachers who dismissed her children as problem students, and customers who wouldn't meet her eyes. But something about this moment, the ease with which they degraded her humanity in a room that reeked of wealth, stung deeper. They hadn't even paused to wonder if she was there. That was the part that cut the most. She wasn't even worth noticing. Still, she said nothing. She pushed her cart to the elevator, kept her head high, and left the room with dignity. No tears. Not here. But the second blow came later that afternoon, and it landed differently. Karen had been called to tidy up after the investors' lunch. She entered the same boardroom, this time mid-conversation. The Roths were still there, but now several outside investors were seated around the table. Karen started to back out, not wanting to interrupt, but Gregory waved a hand. No, no, let her clean. She's like wallpaper. Won't bother anyone. The room chuckled. Then Chloe turned to one of the investors and, gesturing toward Karen, said, "This is our corporate diversity hire, keeps the place sparkling and politically correct." Laughter erupted. Karen froze. The room continued without missing a beat. Discussions turned to portfolios and quarterly projections. But for Karen, time had stopped. The heat rose in her chest. Her eyes locked on a window pane across the room, watching her own reflection blink back at her, a woman standing tall in her uniform, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing. The silence in her mind was deafening. The decision formed not from rage, but clarity. Something had to change. She couldn't look her children in the eyes anymore, not if she let this continue. She finished the cleaning quietly, just as she always had. But in her heart, the gears had already begun to shift. She would not stay silent this time. The rules that had kept her safe were no longer enough. Respect wasn't given, it was taken, demanded, earned through action. And Karen Daniels was ready to act. Karen sat alone in the dim light of her small apartment, the events of the day playing over and over in her mind. The laughter. The snide remarks. The crude imitation that mocked not just her, but generations of her culture and identity. The faces of her co-workers, some indifferent, some quietly amused, some averting their gaze, it all haunted her. She had worked tirelessly to reach this point, climbing the professional ladder rung by rung, always careful, always composed. Now, in a single moment, her confidence felt fractured. The racist mockery she endured was more than just a personal slight, it was a reminder of the broader societal structures that sought to keep her in place. Karen's first instinct had been to bury the hurt, to silence the rising tide of anger within her. After all, she had responsibilities, a family that depended on her, a career she had fought for. Confrontation had always seemed like a risk too great to take. But this time was different. Something had shifted inside her. As the hours passed, Karen's initial confusion gave way to reflection. She questioned why she had tolerated so much for so long, why she had let her worth be diminished by others' ignorance. She realized she had always carried the burden of silence, trying to prove her value through performance, through perseverance. But that silence was no longer sustainable. It had turned into a prison. And now, she could feel the walls cracking. Karen's anger, raw and unfamiliar in its intensity, began to settle into a deeper, more focused emotion, a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her own pain anymore. It was about dignity, justice, and the future she wanted for her children. She couldn't let them grow up thinking this kind of treatment was acceptable, or worse, normal. They needed to see her stand, to see that their mother would not be broken by cruelty disguised as humor. Over the next few days, Karen returned to work with a calm that masked the storm within. She watched, listened, and observed everything more closely than ever. The company, outwardly polished and progressive, was a tightly controlled empire ruled by a powerful billionaire family. Publicly, they spoke of diversity and inclusion, but behind closed doors, Karen now saw the gaps in their facade. The very culture she had tried so hard to adapt to was built on exclusion, on quiet prejudices whispered behind corporate smiles. Determined to act, but not foolishly, Karen took a strategic approach. She began researching the company's structure, its leadership, and its major financial movements. Her instincts led her to a major development, a billion-dollar business deal set to launch within months. The project was enormous, involving international partnerships, high-stakes investments, and political maneuvering. It was the kind of deal that could either elevate the family's empire to new heights or, if derailed, expose their vulnerabilities. Karen saw this deal as her leverage not for revenge, but for recognition and change. She knew the potential fallout of such a bold move. If she failed, she could lose her job, her income, her security. But if she succeeded, she could force a conversation the company had long avoided. Quietly, she began to gather internal documents, tracking timelines, noting irregularities, and identifying potential ethical breaches that could call the entire project into question. This wasn't about blackmail, it was about truth. Karen wasn't interested in playing their game. She wanted them to see her, to understand the cost of their silence and complicity. Each late night spent digging through files was an act of defiance, each piece of information another brick in the foundation of her stand. She didn't know exactly how she would use the information yet, but she knew the mere act of uncovering it was already transforming her. With each passing day, Karen's fear diminished, replaced by something stronger. She started to walk differently, hold herself differently. She no longer avoided eye contact in meetings. She began to ask pointed questions. She was no longer hiding in the shadows of her own workplace. There was risk in every move she made, but she welcomed it. For the first time, she was no longer adapting to survive, she was positioning herself to lead. Still, moments of doubt crept in. She wondered if she was being reckless, if her desire for justice would jeopardize the very stability she had worked so hard to build. But then she would think of her children, of the legacy she was shaping for them, and the doubts would fade. Karen had always been resilient, but now she was resolute. The shift in her perspective wasn't just about the company or the deal, it was about herself. She was no longer willing to shrink herself to fit into spaces that refused to acknowledge her humanity. She was done apologizing for existing, for daring to dream of more. Every choice she made now was a declaration: she mattered. Her voice mattered. As Karen continued her quiet investigation, she began to see the layers of hypocrisy within the organization. The same executives who mocked her behind closed doors were signing public pledges of inclusion. The same HR representatives who smiled in meetings turned a blind eye to internal complaints. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deeply systemic the rot was. But she also realized something else: she wasn't alone. Whispers from colleagues, subtle gestures, quiet words of encouragement began to surface. Others had noticed the mockery, the unfairness, the contradictions. Some were afraid, like she had been. Some were angry. and some were waiting for someone to make the first move. Karen's resolve grew not only from her own courage, but from the silent support around her. She began to see the possibility of collective action, of using the truth she was uncovering as a catalyst for something larger than herself. She didn't need to destroy the company, she needed to force it to reckon with itself. In this new reality, Karen was no longer just an employee. She had become a disruptor. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Her transformation wasn't about becoming someone else, it was about finally becoming who she had always been, unafraid and unapologetic. Karen's decision to take action marks a critical turning point. No longer content to be a passive observer, she begins to operate with quiet precision, each step calculated to uncover and ultimately expose the dark undercurrents of the billion-dollar deal. Recognizing that the opportunity before her is rare and dangerous, Karen channels her frustration and moral conviction into a plan that could upend one of the most powerful families in the corporate world. Her target, the unethical foundation on which the billionaires built their empire. She begins by organizing everything she knows about the deal: timelines, players involved, contractual loopholes, and unexplained financial movements. Using her insider access, she quietly pulls records, internal reports, and communication threads that most would overlook. With each document she gathers, the shape of the corruption begins to take form. Patterns emerge: environmental impact reports that were altered, safety concerns dismissed, and cost-cutting measures that exploited workers. The deal, marketed as a historic partnership promising growth and innovation, is actually a thin veil covering decades of malpractice. Despite the critical nature of her work, Karen remains under constant scrutiny. The billionaire family's condescension and dismissiveness continue, veiled behind polite words and forced smiles. Board meetings and corporate dinners become battlegrounds of subtle hostility. She is sidelined in decisions, her ideas ignored, and her presence treated as inconvenient. These slights, though masked in civility, strike deep. But rather than weakening her, they sharpen her focus. Every insult becomes a reminder of why she cannot back down. As Karen dives deeper into the financial infrastructure of the deal, she uncovers layers of manipulation. Shell companies have been set up to move funds discreetly, stock prices have been artificially influenced by staged press releases, and key stakeholders have been misled about the true state of the partnership. It becomes clear that the deal is not just unethical, it's fraudulent at its core. If exposed, the revelations would not only unravel the agreement but irreparably tarnish the family's legacy. The weight of her discovery presses heavily on her. Karen knows she is holding a kind of power most people never touch, not just the power to change a deal, but to redefine the balance of power within an empire. It is no longer simply about exposing corruption. It is about justice, legacy, and the opportunity to give voice to those who were trampled by unchecked ambition. But power comes with danger. As the scope of her investigation expands, Karen becomes aware that her actions may not remain unnoticed much longer. Suspicious glances follow her in the office. Her access to certain files is suddenly restricted. A memo is circulated emphasizing loyalty and confidentiality, an obvious warning in corporate language. She starts noticing strangers near her home, odd clicks during phone calls, and emails disappearing from her inbox. The threat is no longer theoretical. The family, or those loyal to them, may be onto her. Still, Karen refuses to retreat. She knows what is at stake: not just the money, not even just the justice, but the message that silence in the face of power is complicity. Quietly, she builds a network. She reaches out to investigative journalists known for exposing corporate fraud. She consults legal experts, disguised as hypothetical inquiries, to understand her rights and protections. Every conversation is encrypted, every meeting anonymous. She keeps meticulous records hidden in multiple secure locations. Trust is rationed carefully. Through these conversations, Karen's resolve deepens. She begins to see herself not just as a whistleblower, but as a catalyst. The more she learns from the journalists and lawyers, the more she understands the broader implications of her plan. The workers who suffered in silence, the communities polluted by the company's disregard for environmental safety, the investors duped by false promises, they all stand to benefit if the truth comes out. With growing courage, Karen refines her plan. It is no longer about reacting. She is in control now. She devises a timeline to release the information at a moment of maximum impact just before the deal's final signing ceremony. She coordinates with a trusted journalist who agrees to publish the findings in a major exposé. The legal team prepares for the possible fallout and discusses whistleblower protections, ensuring Karen will not stand alone once the storm begins. Karen also begins to consider the aftermath. She anticipates the family's counterattacks, legal threats, character assassinations, attempts to discredit her work. She prepares statements, compiles evidence trails that lead beyond her, and aligns herself with individuals and institutions that cannot be easily silenced. She also quietly reaches out to allies within the company, those who have suffered under the same system, and brings them into the fold. Some are hesitant, fearful. But others are ready, emboldened by her bravery. As the day of the deal's final approval approaches, tension reaches a fever pitch. The family senses something is amiss. Meetings grow colder. Instructions become more forceful. Karen is warned, subtly and then not so subtly, that her involvement in the negotiations is no longer required. She's offered a promotion or, rather, a buyout disguised as advancement, an obvious attempt to remove her from the picture. She refuses. Every moment feels like a balancing act. One slip, one leak, one wrong word could collapse everything she's built. But Karen moves with calm determination. What began as an act of defiance has become a mission rooted in truth. The cost of inaction is now too high. People's lives have been impacted. Legacies shaped by lies. And now, the billionaires who once underestimated her may soon find themselves accountable for what they believed would stay buried. As the final hours tick down before the deal is set to be announced to the world, Karen reviews her files one last time. Everything is ready. The truth is locked and loaded, and when the moment comes, it will hit with precision and clarity. There is no going back, but Karen no longer wants to. Karen sat at her desk, staring at the folder in front of her. Its contents were damning internal memos, financial statements, and scientific reports that outlined a catastrophic environmental disaster directly linked to the company's billion-dollar deal. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a business misstep or corporate negligence. It was deliberate, and it was being hidden. The pristine image of her employer was a facade, and now she held the truth in her hands. Everything changed in that moment. The weight of her discovery was crushing. The documents detailed a plan to drill in a sensitive ecological zone, which would not only destroy biodiversity but also contaminate water sources for nearby communities. The project's profit margins had been exaggerated, the risks downplayed, and several high-level executives had signed off on silencing dissenting voices. It was a calculated deception, and Karen realized she had unknowingly played a part in it, signing off on proposals, drafting reports, attending meetings where the real consequences were obscured behind layers of jargon and optimism. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spiraling. If she spoke up, she would likely lose everything: her job, her financial stability, her future. The company was powerful, with far-reaching influence, and whistleblowers had not fared well in the past. On the other hand, if she stayed quiet, she would be complicit. Could she live with herself knowing that people's lives and entire ecosystems were at risk, all for the sake of corporate profit? As she struggled with the decision, Karen thought of her daughter, Emma. She imagined the world Emma would grow up in, one scarred by greed and indifference if people like her didn't speak out. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were personal. Just when she felt most isolated, help came from an unexpected source. Alan Rice, one of the company's longtime investors, had noticed Karen's growing unease. He had always been different, more thoughtful, more ethical. One afternoon, he approached her privately after a meeting. "I've seen what you've been looking into," he said gently. "And I know you're not the kind of person who lets this slide." Karen was startled but didn't deny it. Something in Alan's voice gave her a sense of safety. "I've been having doubts myself," he continued. "They've gone too far. This isn't just a bad deal, it's criminal. If you're thinking of going public with this, I'll support you. I can help you navigate the fallout." The offer was more than she could have hoped for. With Alan's backing, her path forward became a little less uncertain. But it didn't make the decision easier. She would be risking everything she'd worked for, and there were no guarantees. The company would fight back, hard. They had lawyers, PR firms, and government connections. But Karen also had something they didn't: a conscience that refused to be silenced. Over the next few days, she meticulously gathered everything she needed: duplicates of the documents, backup files, and a secure communication channel with an investigative journalist she trusted. She deleted personal data from her work devices, cleared her schedule, and wrote a letter to her family explaining why she had to do this. Every action was deliberate, calculated. Fear lingered in the background, but determination had taken the wheel. The night before she released the documents, Karen stood in front of her apartment window, looking out over the city. It was quiet, but her mind was a storm. Her phone buzzed: a final message from Alan. "Whatever happens next, you're doing the right thing." It gave her the courage to go through with it. The next morning, she submitted the information to the press. In that instant, something shifted inside her. It was as if a dam had broken. Years of compromise, silence, and moral discomfort washed away. For the first time in a long while, Karen felt aligned with her values. She had taken a stand. It wasn't just about the environment or the people affected, it was about reclaiming her integrity. But there was no time to bask in that feeling. The company reacted swiftly. Legal threats, character attacks, internal emails discrediting her as unstable and disloyal. Karen was suspended pending an internal investigation. News outlets began picking up the story, and public pressure started to mount. Protesters appeared outside the company's headquarters. Social media exploded. The narrative was changing. Despite the chaos, Karen remained centered. She had expected the backlash, but what surprised her was the outpouring of support from former colleagues, environmental groups, even strangers. People began to speak up, emboldened by her actions. Whistleblowers from other departments came forward. A class action lawsuit was filed by affected communities. The company's stock began to tumble, and regulators opened a formal investigation. It was the beginning of a long battle, but Karen had already won the most important one within herself. Her fear had not dictated her actions. She had chosen truth over comfort, justice over safety. And though the road ahead would be rocky, she no longer walked it alone. Her decision marked a shift not just in her own life, but in the corporate culture around her. Karen's stand became a symbol, a rallying cry for ethical accountability in a world where profit too often trumps principle. The moment she chose to send the information was not just a turning point in the narrative, it was the moment she truly became the person she had always hoped to be. The fallout from Karen's decision is both swift and destructive. As news of the billion-dollar corruption deal breaks, media outlets seize on the story with fervor. Headlines across national and international platforms expose the shady dealings of the once untouchable billionaire family. Investigative journalists dig deep, revealing a tangled web of financial manipulation, political influence, and exploitation that shocks the public. The carefully crafted image of prestige and philanthropy the family had maintained for decades begins to collapse under the weight of damning evidence. Within the family's inner circle, chaos erupts. Charles, the patriarch and ruthless strategist, is blindsided by the leak. His fury is immediate and unrelenting. Determined to find the whistleblower, he launches a private investigation, employing surveillance teams, cyber experts, and high-profile attorneys to uncover the source. Trust within the family and the company disintegrates as paranoia spreads. No one is above suspicion, and internal loyalty is tested. What was once a formidable empire begins to fracture from within. Karen, meanwhile, becomes the target of their vengeance. The retaliation is both calculated and relentless. She receives threatening messages, her emails and personal data are hacked, and anonymous figures begin to follow her. Her workplace, previously supportive, suddenly distances itself. Rumors circulate about her professional integrity, and colleagues start avoiding her. The company subtly begins the process of pushing her out, using fabricated misconduct and bureaucratic maneuvers to undermine her position. The pressure escalates further when the threats extend to her family. Strange cars idle outside her home at night, and her children are followed on their way to school. Friends express concern but are too afraid to intervene, aware of the family's reach and influence. Karen finds herself increasingly isolated, trapped between fear and duty. Yet, even under immense pressure, Karen does not waver. She is overwhelmed, yes, gripped by fear, sleepless nights, and moments of deep uncertainty, but she refuses to be silenced. The emotional weight is immense. She questions whether she did the right thing, whether she should have remained silent for the sake of her family's safety. Doubt creeps in, gnawing at her during the quiet moments. But each time she is on the brink of giving in, she remembers why she took the risk in the first place: justice, accountability, and the need to expose the rot that had infected the system for far too long. Karen's internal conflict is intense and raw. Her life is unraveling before her eyes, and yet, deep inside, there's a growing clarity. Despite the chaos, she feels a sense of purpose she never had before. She has become a symbol of defiance in the face of overwhelming power. As the story spreads, support begins to grow. People take to social media, creating hashtags in her name. Activists, journalists, and everyday citizens begin rallying behind her, calling for further investigation and reform. Public protests erupt in major cities, demanding that those involved in the corrupt deal be held accountable. Karen's story becomes a rallying cry for whistleblowers everywhere. The more the billionaire family tries to discredit her, the more people believe in her integrity. Her bravery shines through the intimidation campaign. Where the family had hoped to instill fear, they inadvertently inspired a movement. Karen's transformation becomes evident. No longer just a whistleblower, she evolves into a reluctant but powerful leader. The experience hardens her resolve. She begins to work closely with investigative reporters, supplying them with more evidence, timelines, and internal communications. She starts attending interviews and public forums, speaking candidly about the risks she took and why the truth mattered more than comfort or security. Amid all this, her family too undergoes a transformation. Though initially terrified, they slowly begin to understand the significance of what she has done. Her children, once confused and afraid, look up to her with pride. Her spouse becomes her strongest supporter, standing beside her through every court hearing and interview, a quiet pillar of strength. Karen's actions begin to bear fruit. Government officials open formal investigations into the family's business practices. Legislators start debating whistleblower protection laws. Other individuals within the industry begin coming forward with their own stories, emboldened by her example. What began as a solitary act of defiance blossoms into a sweeping movement for truth and accountability. Still, the path is far from easy. Karen faces constant legal battles and mounting financial strain. The family sues her for defamation and breach of confidentiality, dragging her through a complex and exhausting legal process. Each hearing is a reminder of the uphill battle she faces, a reminder that power does not relinquish control easily. But despite the legal warfare, she holds firm, supported by a growing network of allies, lawyers, activists, and citizens who refuse to let her stand alone. The chapter captures not only the cost of her actions but also the emerging sense of empowerment that comes from choosing integrity over silence. The title, The Price of Truth, takes on its full meaning here. Karen has paid dearly, her privacy, safety, career, and peace of mind all sacrificed in the pursuit of justice. But in return, she has gained something more profound, the knowledge that her actions sparked change. She understands now that truth does not come without consequences, but those consequences can lead to transformation not just personal, but societal. Karen's ordeal illustrates a deeper truth about courage, that it often appears in the quiet moments of doubt, in the choice to continue when retreat seems easier. She never sought fame or attention, only justice. And through her unwavering commitment, she discovers that integrity, when wielded with courage, is more powerful than wealth, influence, or fear. Though the family continues to fight back, their grip weakens. Their name, once synonymous with untouchable prestige, is now associated with deceit and greed. Karen, once a solitary figure caught in their shadow, now stands in the light, flawed, vulnerable, but unbroken. The aftermath of her choice is far from over, but she walks into the storm with the quiet power of someone who chose truth over silence and in doing so, gave others the strength to do the same. The pressure on Karen had never felt so immense, so personal. With every passing day, the Billionaire family's campaign against her escalated. What began as a private conflict quickly evolved into a public war. Legal notices arrived in stacks, each one a fresh attempt to drown her in litigation. The lawsuits were overwhelming in their scope and frequency, designed to exhaust her resources and crush her spirit. The family's legal team, bolstered by a near-limitless war chest, filed claim after claim, each more convoluted and aggressive than the last. These weren't just battles in court, they were battles for control of the narrative, for her sanity, and for her right to stand her ground. The smear campaigns followed swiftly. Her name was dragged through headlines, her character dissected and distorted on social media. Old acquaintances came forward with exaggerated stories. Anonymous sources painted her as unstable, reckless, even dangerous. It was a deliberate, targeted strategy to discredit her, to frame her not as a mother protecting her family or a woman seeking justice but as a threat to be neutralized. The public, ever hungry for scandal, absorbed the lies readily. Some of her closest allies began to waver, not because they believed the accusations, but because they feared the consequences of association. Internally, the toll was devastating. Karen felt the weight of fear pressing in from all sides. Fear for her children, who had started asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Fear that she might lose everything, not just material possessions, but the essence of who she was. At night, when the world was quiet, the doubts crept in. Was it worth it? Could she really win? Did her actions make her selfish or brave? These thoughts haunted her, gnawed at her resolve, and left her staring into the dark, searching for strength she wasn't sure she had left. Her relationship with her family suffered. The stress fractured their sense of normalcy. Conversations became tense, filled with unspoken fears and mounting frustration. Her children, once shielded from the harsh realities of the world, now faced them head-on. They witnessed their mother transform from caregiver to combatant and struggled to understand what that meant for their lives. Their routines changed. Their sense of safety was shaken. Their future, once stable, felt uncertain. Karen saw it in their eyes, the confusion, the fear, and it cut deeper than any headline or lawsuit ever could. Still, amid the chaos, something within Karen began to shift. She started to look beyond the immediate pain, beyond the legal battles and public ridicule. In the quiet moments, she reflected on why she started this fight in the first place. She remembered the injustice that first ignited her fury, the moment she realized that silence was complicity. The fear was real, yes, but so was her purpose. She began to understand that the struggle wasn't just hers. The systems arrayed against her, the legal games, the media manipulation, the societal judgment weren't unique to her story. They were part of a larger structure designed to protect the powerful and silence the rest. This realization brought with it a renewed sense of clarity. Karen stopped seeing herself solely as a victim or even as a survivor. She saw herself as part of something bigger, a movement of voices that had long been ignored or crushed. Her battle with the billionaire family became symbolic. It wasn't just about her family anymore, it was about every family who had suffered in silence, every person who had been told they didn't matter. It was about exposing the rot beneath the surface and daring to demand accountability. Her resilience grew not because the attacks lessened, but because her mindset evolved. She stopped reacting out of fear and began acting with intention. She built alliances with those who saw through the smears and recognized the courage in her fight. Lawyers, journalists, activists, people who had spent their lives challenging power began to rally to her side. Together, they began to shift the narrative. Piece by piece, they dismantled the lies. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. Fear didn't disappear. It remained, lurking in the background, reminding her of what she stood to lose. But she no longer let it dictate her choices. Instead, she used it as fuel. Each threat reminded her of the stakes. Each betrayal clarified who she could trust. Every moment of doubt was an opportunity to reaffirm her convictions. She didn't need to be fearless, she only needed to be brave enough to keep going. Her children, watching her navigate the storm, began to change too. They saw the strength behind her tired eyes. They heard the conviction in her voice, even when it trembled. Slowly, they stopped asking if everything would be okay and started asking how they could help. The fear hadn't vanished from their lives, but it had been replaced bit by a sense of purpose. Karen's struggle was no longer a burden they carried alone. It became a lesson in courage, in standing up for what's right, even when the world seems against you. Karen emerged from this chapter of her life not untouched, but transformed. The scars remained, physical and emotional. The legal fights were ongoing, and the media still buzzed with half-truths and speculation. But within her, something fundamental had shifted. The deeper struggle, the one within herself, had revealed a new identity. She was no longer just reacting to injustice, she was confronting it head-on. She was no longer merely protecting her family, she was challenging the very systems that threatened them. In this transformation, Karen found resilience not as a shield, but as a sword. It wasn't about enduring the storm, it was about choosing to walk through it with her head held high. She accepted that fear would never fully leave her, but she no longer viewed it as the enemy. Fear, she realized, was a sign that she was doing something meaningful, something that mattered. And with that understanding, she kept moving forward, eyes open, heart steady, ready for whatever came next. Karen spent long nights meticulously crafting a strategy that would stand up against the immense power and influence of the billionaire family determined to destroy her. Her years of investigation had yielded documents, whistleblower testimonies, and internal records that painted a damning picture of corruption, environmental abuse, and systemic manipulation. But to take them down, she needed more than just truth, she needed precision, allies, and courage. After weighing every option and discussing the stakes with legal experts, Karen came to a critical decision: the battle would have to go public. A courtroom trial, no matter how drawn out or perilous, would offer transparency. It would force the billionaire family to defend their actions in front of the world. Alongside this legal route, she would launch a massive public campaign to bring widespread attention to their crimes, ensuring the truth couldn't be buried in technicalities or backroom deals. The legal team she assembled was made up of seasoned professionals with experience in corporate crime and environmental law. They reviewed every shred of evidence, preparing for the aggressive defense the family's army of lawyers would certainly mount. Meanwhile, Karen forged alliances with advocacy groups, organizations focused on environmental justice, economic inequality, and corporate accountability. These groups offered both moral and logistical support, bringing in media contacts, research, and boots on the ground to help with the campaign. She also sought out other whistleblowers, former employees, contractors, and insiders who had previously been silenced or intimidated into compliance. Some had suffered severe personal and professional consequences for attempting to speak out. But Karen's courage reignited their own. With renewed strength, they came forward, giving testimonies and contributing vital information that filled in gaps in the broader story. Karen understood that to succeed, her campaign couldn't rely solely on outrage. It needed a narrative that was clear, relatable, and emotionally resonant. The team created a media strategy that would highlight real people affected by the billionaire family's misconduct, families displaced by unethical land development, workers poisoned by toxic waste, small businesses crushed by predatory practices. These stories humanized the abstract web of corruption, turning statistics into faces and lives. The campaign launched with a powerful documentary-style video released online. It quickly went viral. Karen stood at the center of the storm, calmly recounting her journey not as a victim, but as a determined citizen refusing to be silenced. The video was followed by a coordinated wave of interviews, op-eds, panel discussions, and public events. Hashtags trend. Protests formed outside the family's corporate offices. Media outlets that had once ignored her story now gave her a platform. As the public trial date approached, the pressure on Karen mounted. She was well aware of what she was up against. The billionaire family didn't just possess wealth, they had deep political connections, private intelligence firms, and a reputation for crushing opposition through smear campaigns, lawsuits, and coercion. In preparation, Karen took every precaution to protect herself and her allies. Legal protections were secured for whistleblowers, and digital security experts helped safeguard communications and evidence from sabotage. In private moments, she reflected on what she stood to lose: her career, her privacy, even her safety. But she also knew that silence was no longer an option. The cost of inaction was too high, not just for her, but for everyone who had suffered under the family's unchecked dominance. This fight had grown beyond personal revenge or vindication. It had become a broader movement for justice. As the trial began, the courtroom became a national spectacle. Crowds gathered outside. Reporters filled the seats. The Billionaire family's legal team tried to dismiss the case on procedural grounds, attempted to discredit witnesses, and accused Karen of being unstable and vengeful. But she held firm, presenting her evidence with clarity and composure. Her team countered each deflection with irrefutable facts and a growing parade of credible witnesses. The turning point came when a former high-ranking executive from within the family's conglomerate took the stand. He confirmed what many had suspected but could never prove: bribery of public officials, falsification of environmental reports, manipulation of financial markets, and deliberate targeting of critics. His testimony shattered the illusion of the family's legitimacy and sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Outside, the media campaign had reached a fever pitch. Protesters filled city squares. Educational seminars and teach-ins were held in universities. Civil society groups organized letter-writing campaigns and petitions demanding government action. International media picked up the story, framing Karen as a symbol of defiance against corporate impunity. Through all this, Karen remained focused. Though emotionally drained and physically exhausted, she never lost sight of the stakes. This was her last stand, the culmination of years of work, risk, and sacrifice. She had prepared herself for every outcome, even failure. But with each passing day, the tide seemed to turn further in her favor. Karen had tapped into something deeper than outrage. She had awakened a collective consciousness. Her story resonated with those who had felt powerless for too long. It reminded people that justice wasn't just an abstract principle but something worth fighting for, even when the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against you. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the narrative had shifted entirely. No longer was she a lone whistleblower taking on a giant; she was the face of a movement, the voice of countless others who had been silenced. The final plan had worked not because it had destroyed the Billionaire family yet, but because it had exposed them and created a path forward. Whether the court ruled in her favor or not, Karen had already succeeded in the most important way: the truth was out, and it could not be put back in the dark. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the long-awaited trial began. Seats were packed with journalists, activists, and citizens eager to witness a moment that had come to symbolize a broader fight against corruption and abuse of power. The Billionaire family, once untouchable, now sat on the defense bench, led by the cold and calculating Charles, whose name had long been synonymous with influence, wealth, and unchecked authority. Opposite them stood Karen, a symbol of resilience, conviction, and the kind of bravery that inspires change. As the trial commenced, the prosecution laid out its case with meticulous detail. Years of deception, cover UPS, and environmental violations were laid bare. Photos, leaked documents, internal emails, and whistleblower testimonies painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. The billionaires had engaged in illegal dumping of toxic waste, manipulated regulatory frameworks, silenced journalists, and funneled money through shell corporations to mask their wrongdoings. But more than the facts, it was the human cost of their actions: the displaced families, the poisoned water supplies, the devastated ecosystems that lent the trial its emotional weight. Karen's evidence had been painstakingly gathered over months, often at great personal risk. She had infiltrated boardrooms, earned the trust of disillusioned insiders, and collected proof that no one thought could be uncovered. Her dedication had already inspired grassroots movements and made headlines, but now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, it became clear just how extensive and irreversible the damage had been. Screens lit up with satellite images of deforestation, video testimonials from victims, and records of forged compliance certificates. The courtroom fell silent at the gravity of what had been concealed for so long. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: Karen's testimony. She took the stand, composed but with visible emotion. The weight of the struggle behind her and the hopes of many on her shoulders, she began to speak. Her voice, though soft at first, grew stronger as she recounted the lies she had uncovered, the threats she had faced, and the countless people whose lives had been irreparably harmed. She didn't just present facts, she humanized the fight. She spoke not as a lawyer or an activist, but as someone who refused to stand by while others suffered. Her words were not rehearsed, but raw and real. Karen's moral clarity became the trial's compass. The defense, led by a team of high-priced lawyers, tried to undermine her credibility, portraying her as naive, emotionally driven, and out of her depth. Charles himself took the stand and spoke with practiced confidence, trying to reframe the issue as a smear campaign fueled by envy and misunderstanding. He presented carefully tailored reports and expert witnesses paid to question the scientific findings. It was a calculated attempt to drown the truth in confusion and legal technicalities. But Karen refused to be shaken. With each cross-examination, she held her ground, calmly refuting claims and reinforcing the truth with integrity. Public sentiment, which had already been leaning in her favor, surged. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted in solidarity, demanding accountability and systemic change. The media followed every twist of the trial, amplifying Karen's voice and turning the courtroom battle into a nationwide reckoning. Just when the outcome seemed uncertain, a turning point arrived. One of the Billionaire family's longtime investors, who had initially remained silent, requested to address the court. It was an unexpected move that shifted the atmosphere instantly. The investor, once a staunch supporter of the company's ventures, confessed to having knowledge of the illegal operations and provided undisclosed files that further implicated the family. The documents confirmed years of deliberate environmental destruction, falsified safety reports, and the deliberate silencing of internal dissent. This revelation was the final blow. The courtroom gasped as damning figures and confessions surfaced. Even the defense attorneys seemed momentarily stunned. Karen's perseverance had not only encouraged victims to speak out but had also inspired someone from within the corrupt system to take a stand for the truth. The betrayal from within the Billionaire's circle marked the collapse of their defense. As the judge delivered the verdict, the atmosphere was electric. The Billionaire family was found guilty on all major counts: environmental crimes, corporate fraud, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted. Cheers, tears, and applause filled the room. For Karen, it was not just a win on paper, it was the culmination of a deeply personal and moral journey. She had confronted a titan of power and emerged victorious not by playing their game, but by rewriting the rules entirely. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. the billionaires were ordered to pay massive reparations to affected communities and environmental recovery funds. Their assets were frozen, and key members of the family faced prison sentences. Most notably, the controversial $1 billion deal that had sparked Karen's investigation in the first place was annulled. It was a powerful message: no one, regardless of status or wealth, was above the law. But the real victory was intangible. It was in the shift of public consciousness, the hope rekindled in everyday citizens, and the realization that speaking truth to power could lead to real change. Karen's courage had reminded the world that justice, though often delayed and obstructed, was not beyond reach. She had turned a courtroom into a battlefield and emerged not only as a victor but as a catalyst for a movement. As the trial concluded and the court was adjourned, Karen stepped outside into a crowd of supporters who chanted her name. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Karen remained grounded. The journey had cost her emotionally, physically, professionally, but it had also restored something larger than herself: faith in justice. The battle had been won not just with evidence, but with integrity, persistence, and the undeniable power of truth. The legacy of the trial would echo far beyond the courtroom, setting a precedent for future cases and encouraging others to rise against oppression, no matter how formidable the opponent. Karen's victory marks a defining moment not only in her personal journey but also in the broader fight for justice. The cancellation of the billion-dollar deal represents far more than a financial loss for the powerful billionaire family. It symbolizes the unraveling of a system built on exploitation, deceit, and unchecked influence. With the truth laid bare for all to see, their dominance begins to erode, and the structures they once controlled start to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. As news of the scandal spreads, the public response is swift and powerful. People take to the streets, not in protest, but in celebration of a rare and hard-won triumph. Media outlets, once silenced or manipulated by those in power, now freely report on the courage of the whistleblower who dared to challenge a corrupt empire. Karen, who once swept the floors of the very buildings where decisions were made to undermine communities, now stands at the center of national attention. But she wears this spotlight not with vanity, but with a quiet dignity, aware of the price she paid and the sacrifices she endured to reach this point. Recognition comes not just in the form of praise, but in the tangible changes her actions begin to inspire. Investigations are launched into other corrupt dealings tied to the billionaire family and their associates. Policies are revisited, whistleblower protections are strengthened, and citizens feel empowered to speak up. Karen's name becomes synonymous with truth and accountability. Her transformation from an invisible worker to a public figure is not driven by ego but by necessity. Karen never set out to be a hero, she simply refused to look the other way. Yet in doing so, she became exactly what the world needed: a reminder that bravery does not require a title, and change does not demand permission. The community that once overlooked her now looks up to her. Neighbors, colleagues, and strangers alike are moved by her resolve, finding in her story a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. Karen's family, once living under the weight of uncertainty and hardship, begins to feel the warmth of stability returning to their lives. Her children, once unsure of their place in a world that seemed to reward silence over integrity, now walk with pride. They speak of their mother not just as someone who cleaned offices, but as someone who cleaned the rot from within the very halls of power. Their home, once marked by fear and restraint, becomes a place of inspiration and possibility. The legacy Karen builds is not confined to headlines or fleeting fame. It lives on in community centers where people gather to discuss reforms, in classrooms where her story is taught as part of civic education, and in the quiet confidence of everyday people who now understand the strength of their voices. Her actions spark movements, conversations, and a collective awakening that change is not just possible, it is inevitable when someone dares to act. Karen is invited to speak at events, forums, and educational institutions, not because she sought recognition, but because her words carry weight. She speaks honestly about her fears, the isolation she faced, and the moments she doubted herself. Yet she also speaks with clarity and conviction about the values that sustained her: truth, justice, and the unwavering belief that even the smallest voice can echo through the corridors of power if it is brave enough to speak. While some attempt to rewrite the narrative or minimize her role, the truth of Karen's journey is already etched into the public consciousness. People remember the janitor who exposed the lies of the elite, not as a figure of pity or surprise, but as a symbol of what is possible when morality triumphs over money. Karen becomes a catalyst, inspiring others to examine their roles within systems, to challenge injustices they once accepted as unchangeable, and to stand up in their own ways, no matter how small they may seem. As institutions reckon with the fallout of the scandal, they begin to rebuild not just with new leadership, but with new values. Karen consults on reforms, lending her insight not as an outsider, but as someone who understands the inner workings of both the oppressed and the oppressors. She helps shape initiatives that prioritize transparency, inclusion, and equity. Her input is no longer dismissed, because her impact is undeniable. But even as her public profile grows, Karen remains grounded. She returns often to the places that shaped her, the neighborhoods that raised her, the workplaces that once ignored her voice, and the people who stood by her when it would have been easier to walk away. She offers mentorship and guidance to others who face similar crossroads, reminding them that fear is natural, but silence is a choice. The story culminates not in a final victory, but in a new beginning. Karen stands tall, not as a woman who has all the answers, but as one who refused to be silenced. She carries the scars of her battle with pride, each one a testament to the strength it took to endure. In her quiet moments, she reflects on the road behind her, on the nights of doubt, the threats she endured, the loneliness of truth-telling, and finds peace in knowing she stayed true to herself. Looking toward the future, Karen knows the fight is far from over. There will be new injustices, new obstacles, and new voices that need to be heard. But she no longer walks alone. She has sparked something larger than herself: a movement, a mindset, a legacy. The power once concentrated in the hands of a few has been challenged by the courage of one, and that challenge has awakened many. Karen's story becomes more than just a personal triumph. It becomes a cultural shift, a historical marker, and a moral compass. It reminds society that change does not come from perfection, but from persistence. That leadership is not granted, but earned through action. And that the legacy we leave is defined not by our titles or wealth, but by our willingness to fight for what's right, even when it costs us everything. In the final moments, Karen stands not as a janitor or a whistleblower, but as a change maker. Her eyes are set not on the past she endured, but on the future she now helps to shape. Her legacy is one of justice, courage, and the enduring belief that one voice, when used with conviction, can change the course of history. The power of truth and resilience, once ignited, can never be extinguished.